of the Republican interest groups, supporters, consider themselves at war. They consider them that with a variety. And so basically you're setting up a situation where we are at war, and either you step up and you form an extremist group because you're in a war. They're in a war with you. You've been attacked. And it sort of ends up being an interesting kind of political approach, which is never any holds barred, never any prisoners taken. You're either with us or against us. That's an interesting worldview, an interesting political outcome of kind of extremism and war, and I see them as the same.
I guess what I would want to make a distinction between polarization and extremism. What the Republican Party has done since, well, I think I think since Goldwater, is the Republican Party has sought power through polarizing the electorate. And so what it has essentially done, and I think a lot of this has to do with the breakdown of segregation and what has caused is the realignment, in which prior to the 60s, you had it was quite possible to be a conservative Democrat and a liberal Republican. In other words, the parties and the ideologies did not line up. But with the collapse of segregation, all the conservative Democrats have fled the national scene politically, and they're still slowly fleeing the Democratic Party at the local level in the South. But and also all the liberal Republicans in the Midwest and the Northeast have basically abandoned the Republican Party. And so what you have is which now almost all conservatives are in the Republican Party and all liberals are in the Democratic Party. That is a relatively recent historical phenomenon, at least up until the New Deal, say. And what that encourages is polarization. That encourages talk radio. That encourages the pundits to rile up the base and to say what it's friends and enemies and whatever Rush Limbaugh is saying or Glenn Beck is saying. That makes sense in a polarized political climate. But until Glenn Beck and Limbaugh and Palin and other Republican elites begin to say, we might need to arm ourselves and get ready if this next election doesn't go the way we want. Angle did that, and she lost. Right? And she was. I'm not saying that Angle. I'm willing to acknowledge that Angle might be an extremist, but I would not say that Limbaugh is. I would not say that Beck is. I would not say that the Tea Party is because until they start saying the system is illegitimate, I think you're talking about polarization, not extremism. And frankly, I think that polarization has its advantages. I would like to see you all get a little more polarized, frankly.
I hear that.
I'd like to see it. There's a lot of, one side talks about come to the middle, the other side doesn't. Who's going to win that battle? Who's going to win? You all are going to get your butts kicked every time until you say, until you say, you know what? You're the enemy, and we're going to battle it out. And don't need to go outside the boundaries of respectable politics to do so. And I'm willing to take some lumps. But until you do that, this state is going to be, everything Mr. Furlong said about the state politics is going to continue. Yes, ma'am.
There's a couple of things. One is, I'll bet most of us, a lot of us in this room, in the 70s and 80s, participated in demonstrations and places where there were marches and big things where the local folks allowed a big protest to happen, and then there was the civil disobedience line that some of us were willing to cross and get arrested and so forth. That crossing of the line and getting arrested seems to me, I'm thinking of school in America or a lot of other stuff. That line sounds to me a little bit where you're saying the moral extremists are willing to take that risk and suffer the consequences.
Yeah.
But the bigger question for me is, what in the world, how do we ever get anything done when we've got, in Congress, state or the national level, when we've got Democrats now fighting and saying, don't compromise, they're bluffing, we've got to call their bluff. The Republicans are saying, don't compromise, they're bluffing, we've got to call their bluff. How do we ever get anything done when the Democratic Party, some of them are now calling Obama I don't know what, because they're not in
secret Muslim, not born in the United States.
Well, he's not compromising. The Democrats are, because he is compromising. How do we get anything done in the political arena without that willingness to, you know.
Well, I think you have examples of that all the time. It's called parliamentary politics in Europe, in which, you know, in which whether you want to talk about two-party systems like in England or multi-party systems like throughout most of Europe, they're organized according to ideology. But ultimately, the imperative to, the desire to want to rule, and to rule effectively, trumps polarization. And polarization, therefore, becomes part of the method
But in this
of
country,
ruling.
how are we ever going to get back to getting anything done?
It seems to me that the key lesson that the extremists do is this concept of hegemony. Wendell Phillips, the most eloquent and powerful abolitionist speaker after Frederick Douglass, said, he said, you know, before public opinion, laws and parchments are ground into dust. In other words, I think oftentimes, and if I may say this, but I think oftentimes liberals tend to put a lot of weight on the law to protect. And this makes sense since the Reagan era, because because the Democrats have generally been losing since Reagan, and so you want to appeal to the courts to protect what has been created. But Phillips says something the opposite. He says if you can change the way people think, then the laws naturally follow. And so what the extremist has to do is have to change the common sense. And it seems to me that the Republicans are terribly good at taking something as reasonable as an estate tax and calling it a death tax. And all of a sudden, you all are on your heels. What do I do? What do I do? It's not a death tax. It's not a death tax. Once you have to say it's not a death tax, you've lost. You've lost. Until you say it is a youth investment fund or something like that, right? Until you rechange the language, until you rechange what is common sense, you're going to lose. And if you can if you can change the common sense, then you change where the center is politically. That's what the extremists are trying to do. They're trying to change the political center. That's what another way of referring to hegemony. And so if polarization can help you pull the center towards what you like, then you can compromise. Then you've entered the realm in which you can give and take. But until then, perhaps you need to use that kind of polarized politics to pull the center more towards your liking. Yes, sir.
In order to refuse to compromise, don't you also need to, and to pull the center towards your refusal to compromise with your position, you really need to understand and listen to the extreme position on the other side, so that there may be some truth there that you might want to incorporate into your position.
I absolutely agree, and I think this is one of the things that makes the abolitionists such a useful example of this kind of politics, and does not make the anti-abortion movement a very useful example, for example. Because the abolitionists, to my mind, if you want to talk about what distinguishes a zealotry that's consistent with the democratic small d democratic politics and a zealotry that's not, is where do they stand on free speech? If they want to crush free speech in the order of the truth, run away. Where do they stand on, do they want to expand the power of ordinary people in politics to have a say in those affairs that affect their daily lives, or do they want to constrict it? If any extremist wants to constrict it, they become my enemy. Right? And to what extent do they encourage a kind of pluralism? Wendell Phillips, was one of Foster's best friends, and was a fanatic as much as anyone, and actually defends extremism. And I write about Phillips in some of my research. But one day, for example, he was also at this point one of the most famous people in the 19th century. Again, after Douglass, he was the most popular orator in the 19th century in a culture, as you know, that in which oratory, speech was the primary means of communication. And so he's the most famous guy. And one day, a slaveholder from Arkansas comes up, knocks on his door in Boston, and says, "I'd love a tour of revolutionary Boston, and you're the name I know. Would you do it?" And he says, "Sure, but we're going to talk about slavery the whole time." And so he's willing to engage his enemy in that way, in a way that respects that person's opinion and doesn't demonize the individual. I guess that's the term I want. And that kind of, so I would think that the abolitionists did a nice job of that. Al-Qaeda, anti-abortion movement, they don't do such a good job. So, but this is a very different conversation. What kind of extremism do you engage in, rather than how can I hurl an insult at you as an extremist or not? And thereby ignore some of the savvy ways in which you engage in politics.
Or maybe we didn't have to have a civil war if we also dealt with the concerns of the Southern economics, and see if we could create a different kind of economics that didn't depend upon slavery.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way out but war on that one. But that would be an interesting conversation to have. Yeah, but certainly that conversation couldn't even happen because one side was willing to have that conversation, but the other side was not. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, when did the word liberal become a pejorative word? A Republican can call himself a conservative, and that's fine. But how come the poor Democrat calls himself a liberal?
Well, I think Mondale has some responsibility for that, or at least the Reagan's crushing of Mondale has a fair bit to do with that. And to the point where Clinton won't identify as a liberal when he runs for president in '92. But this is exactly the point. This is exactly the point of the common sense. To be a liberal was to be in the center of American politics from Roosevelt's time through Carter's. But now liberal's a dirty word. Well, why is that? Well, it's because the Republicans are much better at changing common sense. And how do they change the common sense? They establish a principle and they attack. And they have strategists like Frank Lutz, for example, who sits there and thinks of how can I come with good key phrases, such as death panels, for example, which is his term, that make it seem like this Obamacare will now cause death, where will kill people and bureaucrats will make decisions, where we have an example of actual bureaucrats actually deciding who gets a transplant or not in the state of Arizona. That's a death panel. But I haven't heard anyone say death panel, death panel, death panel. And I mean, this company accepted, of course. But that just proves that if you can define the discourse, you define the center. And the role of extremism is to redefine the discourse. Yes, sir?
I'm just going to point out, repeat that, this doesn't always end well, the Civil War being a good example. Lincoln's Cooper Union speech, where he says the only thing that will mollify these people is to agree with them 100%, and they're willing to go to war rather than compromise. So then the question becomes, are you willing to fight a war? Not just a figurative one, but a literal one. And that, I think, is the point at which people interested in politics as opposed to revolution have to look inside themselves and see what strategies are there that don't involve laying waste to your entire country. We did that already once. And it didn't stick, actually. Southern irredentism is a big feature of the Republican Party, even today.
Yeah.
So,
well, I agree with you that we should go in, that there's no guarantee of victory in any kind of political struggle. And also, so you should ask yourself, for those in the room who aren't ready to be the next John Brown in this room, then to say, to what extent are polarizing tactics useful, and to what extent am I willing to go and am I willing to lose? And if you're not willing to lose, then you shouldn't do that. Yeah, I think that's the kind of calculations that are exactly important for political actors to make. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to ask you why you think the Democrats and Obama are so inept.
I don't think that. I think they disregard their base in a way that the Republicans don't, and I don't think that's because the Republicans are necessarily nicer to their base. It's because their base is more adamant and insistent, and the Democrats' base is not adamant and insistent. And again, this is that the Republican base are much more willing to polarize. And if you're not forced to listen to your base, then you're not getting pulled to the left. Whereas the other side is pulling hard to the right, the needle's moving. The needle's moving towards the right. Until the base is strong, and again, until that you have that core of people who won't compromise, who are willing to polarize, who are willing to lose occasionally. Yeah. I continue to see the needle moving this way.
We have a couple of more questions, responses, and because I know the hour is getting late.
Okay, good. Come more. Yes, sir.
Alan Wolf said in 2004 that the liberals can't win because we're always willing to compromise. That the only hope for us, we see conservatives as potential friends. They see us as always as enemies, always. The only hope is an American political tradition. The only hope. Can we, I'm asking you, can we win, and is there any